Hey everyone, Stegar here, and welcome back to episode 20 of Hunterville. In today's episode, we're going to be expanding the city in terms of adding a whole lot of new suburbs to the hillier parts of the city near where we were building in the last episode. We also add in a few shops and things around this area just to kind of service the local community. And to start off with the episode, I started out by building out the road layout. I guess this is kind of the foundation for any suburbs that you may be building in this game, is that you kind of have to start out with a basic road layout. In this case, I'm going for less of a gridded style, since I imagine that this area would have been built quite recently, and mixed with the fact that it's on a hill, it doesn't really make much sense to stick to a grid when it might result in something quite steep. But yeah, also the idea that this is a newer area, you have less gridded areas and more sort of cul-de-sac, dead-end street places, and yeah, just placing down a whole lot of roads around the side of this hill. I think at some point it gets too steep that I decide to start deleting parts of this road, like you can see here, and just redoing that to a point where the sort of elevation changes make sense. But now we're starting on a supermarket. For this one, I was just basically using some random warehouse building and then placing down these walls and scaling them down heaps with procedural objects and changing the color of them so that they look a little bit different to how they would originally look. And that just kind of would be like the top of the building, and there might be some sign on there. And using this pack and save asset and just using the front of it, I actually need to replace the pack and save that I attempted to build in episode 16 with this asset. Now that it exists, it didn't exist at the time, but thankfully Hilltop has made that asset since, so I can place that in the city when the time comes. But here I didn't really want to pack and save, so I was just using the front facade of it and changing a whole lot of the colours so that it didn't resemble a pack and save at all, and instead just was kind of some generic supermarket building. And then I think I placed the parking lots for this specific supermarket off camera. Yeah, we just skipped through that. But that's on like quite an elevation difference, so I had to deal with all these differences by placing down this concrete wall to kind of make the bottom of the supermarket building look like it wasn't just floating. Since it's procedural objects, you don't get that endless thing that sort of drags out into the middle of nowhere. But anyway, here we're just now placing down a few of these hedges by Mr. Mason, and just using them to sort of fill up this space, as part of it was quite steep and then it sort of flattened out, but just for the sake of continuity, I guess, doing that the whole way. And then we move over to placing down a few of these houses. Here I'm using fairly modern looking houses for the most part. I was also using these in the previous episode if you're watching that one. And these are probably going to be the houses that I use going forward for sort of outer style suburbs. I also cut through a lot of this footage as it got very repetitive, and as you can see here, just even filling out this little area took a while, but also just adding in a few trees and things, since this area isn't exactly gridded. Nice rectangular shaped houses don't exactly fit nicely into it, and I've found with some experience both in this city and my other project that I've been working on behind the scenes for a while now, that placing trees and things in between the houses seems to work okay. And there I was just placing down some small grass tufts just to fill up the area in between the parking lot for the supermarket and those houses. And now we're moving on to building out a new commercial area in the city. This one is like right across from the supermarket, and just generally includes some of the New Zealand style buildings by Hilltop, as well as some buildings from the University City Content Creator Pack. And then beside the car park for this area, I was placing down a Repco, which is quite a well-known kind of automotive parts store in both Australia and New Zealand. So I just wanted to kind of get that as a nice sort of way that people can recognise that perhaps this is a Australia or New Zealand series, and then moving over to building out these sort of townhouses along the side of the steep area. Because the terrain was really steep here, I decided to turn these buildings into procedural objects and then place down the cubes, the residential cubes, in these buildings afterwards so that they actually function. But with the ones on the top of this hill, I decided to have their normal entrance facing towards the city and hanging out over the cliff, and just pretending that one of the back windows or something is the actual entrance into the building from the street. And then beside one of these buildings, I was placing down like this little elevated parking lot thing. This ended out probably not looking the best, since the size of it is probably not adequate for cars to turn and park, etc. But anyway, I built it here and showing it to you in the time lapse because it's actually staying in the city for the time being. I might extend it or something to make it a bit more realistic at some point, but I was just using these stucco retaining walls as sort of the outline of it, and placing down the parking lot decals as the parking spaces. And then because they're decals, I had to place down prop cars to make it look like they were in use, placing these slightly like not perfectly, as often drivers park not in a perfect way, especially in a sharp place like that. It'd be slightly difficult to park. And then just placing down a whole ton of trees in between these buildings. I tried to use some lower ones in front of the windows there so that people could actually get a view of the city, considering that they're probably paying some ridiculously high amount of money to live in that place in the first place. But here I'm using the Mossy Rocks by Grey Flame just to kind of make the cliffs of this area look a little bit more better or different to the rest of the city, since up until this point I've only really relied on the cliff texture exclusively for cliffs in the city. Mind you, I haven't really done much in hilly areas to bother with the cliff texture. But here I'm just going around with the forest brush with the size set to its minimum so that I can place one tree at a time. And because I'm using prop snapping, the trees snap to the top of these rocks. Sometimes it acts a little bit weird in that they snap to some part of the rock that's not actually there, but eventually I sort of worked out a way that I could place the trees on there quite easily. And then the last little bit of this section of the video was just placing down those trees on the hill there. And here's a reveal of what we achieved in this section of the episode, and then I'll be back to work on the second section of the episode, which is more working in the hilly parts. So I also started off the second part of the episode similar to how I started off the first section, just by placing down some roads. By the way, most of the roads I'm using in this episode are the Suburban Road number 4 by class. I think maybe this one in particular though is just a regular vanilla one for now, as it has a centre line, and I imagine that this particular road is like the main one that leads up to whatever's at the top of this hill, so would have a centre line as there's more traffic on it, and it is a bit more necessary than say this side road that I'm building off now. But anyway, I was also trying to keep in mind how steep this was. I kind of went for a goal of about 10% gradient as my maximum sort of acceptable limit. What that means is that for every 100 meters you go across, you're essentially going up 10 meters at a 10% gradient. And yeah, just making these kind of snake around the edges of the ridges and things in the hill, and trying to make this all look as though it makes sense as to why it's here. And then after building out the rest of these roads, I decided to move over to building the metro line that runs through this area. My original plan was to have the metro tracks kind of snaking up the hill in a similar way to these roads, but because it was way too steep to do that, I decided to instead have the metro tracks kind of lead out to the area to the left of the screen now, and instead that'll just lead out to some suburb and terminate somewhere at the edge of the city, I guess. But yeah, that track, it just didn't really work out, and here you can see me starting to place it down now. Originally I put the track on the surface just to kind of try and get the straight part in the right position, and then went along and ended up making this all underground, including that curve and everything. And then here just placing down the vanilla metro station, but it's been modified with the metro overhaul mod so that the track is facing in a different direction and is offset from the station entrance a little bit. And then just placing down some shops along here. I imagine that this is like the sort of the center of the suburb for a different suburb to the one we were building earlier, and placing down the terraforming network there behind those buildings to make the sort of slope of the alley make sense, and so that the back of these buildings weren't all completely weird. And just doing a little bit of detailing by putting dumpsters down there. And then on the other side of the alley, placing down these buildings. There's some really jagged, horrible, steep terrain there, but I'm honestly not going to worry about it too much since we're on kind of the edge of the city, and this is sort of getting to the point where it's just there to make the city look complete, and probably as we go on in the series, things aren't going to be so detailed as they have been in the past. It also takes a really long time to do that sort of thing. And I have a goal of achieving 1,000 people increase in population each episode, and to achieve that in the future I'm probably going to have to do some trade-offs, as by the end of this episode we're at 16,100 people for episode 20, which is slightly behind my goal, so I need to continue expanding the city at such a rate that that number stays relatively close to the episode number. Basically multiplied by 1,000, but here you would have seen me placing down the Woolworths building with big parking lot out front, as well as that little Shell gas station there. And then we're doing a little bit more expansion in terms of houses and things. For this little bit I'm using the same houses that I was earlier in the episode, but then we're going to change to using some different houses by Leisure. Some of these were made for Prez's Calavera Beach episode, the Laguna slope homes, and there are some other slope homes from Leisure that I'm using as well here. But in general these were actually really nice to use, since they fit to the terrain a bit better, where you've got like this massive cliff face, and otherwise you just have these flat homes, and since these don't flatten the terrain as well, you have a bit more to work with, because often that flattened terrain becomes really jagged and makes unnecessarily steep cliffs. But here I'm just filling in some of these gaps with trees and things. Because of the way that those Laguna homes are, there's like clipping underneath them, so you also have to sort of cover that blue void up with trees or something, or just choose to leave it and try and ignore it, which I did in some cases. As I said before, I'm just going to try and cut back on the detail a little bit in the name of massive expansion, but yeah, generally a lot of this stuff I also skip through, and here again just using these mossy rocks by Grey Flame, and some of them are terrain conforming or something, so you can't move them, but most of them that I was using aren't, so I can adjust the height of them and things, and just going around with the forest brush again and placing down these smaller trees in this area. I imagine that for some reason, maybe it's because this area is newer, or some reason there's smaller trees here anyway, also so people get a better view, but I don't think that would be the main reason. Yeah, and just tree placement in between these houses and things. yeah, because of some weird things with tree snapping, sometimes I just had to select all the trees and use move it and select align to terrain to get them to sit nicely. And then we're moving over to a different area on top of the hillside, and here I'm placing down some larger sort of apartment buildings that just look over the whole city. You get a really nice view of the city from up here and can see the skyline and everything. And at the bottom of these, just going around and adjusting the terrain a bit so it wasn't so steep. As I was saying before, the unnecessarily steep terrain, and this is one of those examples. And then I decided to place a little playground in between the two buildings, just using the vanilla playground assets because I find that they are sufficient enough to achieve what I want to achieve when placing down a playground. Put a little snaking gravel path in between the two buildings as well, and just adding in some grass tufts and trees and bushes and things around here. But in general, sort of the techniques of this episode are very much repetitive. As I said earlier in the episode, this was the first time I've ever really used these grey flame rocks. So I was really just going sort of all out with doing that. But here we're moving onto this park area that's sort of at where this main road sort of turns around on itself to lead further up the hill. So I was just placing down a whole lot of trees there and a path, and again doing the same technique with the mossy rocks. I mean, pretty much the rest of everything in this episode is very much similar to what I've done in previous parts of the episode, so I'll probably just cut everything out beyond this point and say that if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to leave a like. If you've got any feedback for me, comments, ideas of things that would make sense in the city that you want me to include, such as like a stadium or an airport or something like that, I've already thought about those ideas, but your feedback is well appreciated, as I do plan on doing some plans for the city over the next coming weeks as I take a break from the city and work on my other project. But we are going to do a live play tour of the city soon, that will then be followed by a cinematics to sort of round off the last 20 episodes that we've had in the city. If you want to consider subscribing to my channel to see that, then go ahead and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Take care.